Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this is the second lecture discovering the concepts of evolution and natural selection. In this part of the lecture, we'll move on further and talk about types of natural selection. We'll run through a couple practice problems so that you can get a feel for how different scenarios influence the type of natural selection that's shown. And finally, we'll take a look at a totally different form of natural selection based on mate choice, and that is known as sexual selection. And we'll go ahead and explore that one looking at marine mammals. When we take a look at types of natural selection doesn't always move in the same direction. So one of the things that we'll start with is by taking a trait, and what you want to do is you want to arrange the population into a gradient. In the picture shown here, we're clearly looking at mouse coat color, or at least their fur color, and the gradient goes from light all the way to dark. If we imagine a classroom for a moment, imagine that we have a classroom of 30 individuals and we're having all the individuals stand up and arrange themselves by height from short all the way to tall. That's what I mean when I say arrange the population in a gradient. Once we've done that, what we're going to try and do is identify where along that gradient do we see the highest fitness. Okay, there's three possibilities here. The first possibility is where the intermediate phenotype, or the middle of that gradient, has the highest fitness. This one is probably the one that shows up most often. So if we take a look at the height of humans, there's definitely a middle ground there where we see high fitness. Clearly, individuals that are 10 feet tall or individuals that are 2 feet tall at reproductive success are going to have more issues reproductively. Being very, very tall actually comes with health problems, and being very, very small makes carrying a child very difficult. So in those cases, those would be the extremes. We would see lower reproductive success there, and therefore the middle of that gradient has higher reproductive success. And so in the next population, you tend to see many, many more individuals showing the average or around the average. That is known as stabilizing selection. You're stabilizing the population near the average or the mean. Not all types of natural selection work that way. Sometimes, definitely one extreme of that gradient has a higher fitness than the other. In this case, we tend to move in one direction, and so we call that directional selection. In the example shown on the screen, we would say the environment was such that darker colored mice had a higher fitness than lighter colored mice. Perhaps maybe we're on a dirt background, so the light colored mice are really easy to see and they're picked off by hawks, where the dark colored mice blend in very, very well against that dark background, and so are the ones to survive and actually reproduce. Remember, selection only works if you have a heritable trait. So we're assuming in this case that height for humans or color coat for mice are going to be genetically coded. Okay, for humans, let's imagine this silly scenario. We're going to assume once again that we have an entire classroom and we've arranged them by height. And we're going to make up this silly rule. Only individuals that belong to the basketball team are going to be reproductive. Well, of course, most people know that to be tall is going to be an advantage in basketball, so basketball teams tend to be comprised of very tall individuals. So if we allowed that rule to stand, then only tall individuals would be reproducing, and since height does have a strong genetic component, they would tend to produce tall children, whereas those who are not as tall would not be allowed to reproduce, and therefore they would not carry on their genes, and the next generation would show more tall individuals. This would be an example of directional selection, even though it's kind of a silly one. The third type of selection is one that doesn't come up very often, but is most interesting when it does. And this one is when the intermediate phenotype actually has the lowest fitness over the gradient. In other words, both of the extremes have high fitness, but usually for different reasons. And once again, I'm going to imagine that we've taken our classroom of 30 individuals, arrange them by height, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a bunch of medium-sized bears on that classroom. Individuals that are very tall probably would have the capacity to turn around and fight the bears successfully. Individuals that are very small can run away and hide into little crevices, and thus the bears can't get them. But individuals that are of the intermediate height, maybe such as myself, since I'm 5'6", wouldn't be very good at fighting. So I wouldn't have the size to really turn around and put up a good fight, but I'd be too big to turn around and hide in a small crevice. Therefore, individuals of the intermediate size would be the ones that would be most likely picked off by these bears, where the tall ones would survive because they can fight, the smaller ones would survive because they can hide. So those are the ones that reproduce, but for different reasons. This is an example of disruptive selection. Another real example is often seen with birds. Sometimes you get birds of a species that can feed on different seed types. So if you have a bird like a finch with kind of a thick beak, it can go ahead and grab nice big seeds and crunch them because it's got a nice big beak to work with, almost like a parrot's beak. But other birds have a more slender beak that allows them to get fine seeds out of small crevices. Imagine if there was an intermediate beak. It wasn't quite big enough to go ahead and crunch those shells, but in the same sense it was too big to reach in those small crevices and get smaller seeds. That intermediate phenotype would starve because they weren't really good at either eating strategy, and so that would be an example of disruptive selection. All right, so again, if we start with a gradient, depending on the environment and which direction we go, we're going to go ahead and see either stabilizing selection, directional selection, or possibly disruptive selection. At this point, why don't you give it a shot? I have up here 4 different scenarios. What I'd like you to do is pause the video here, write down each question, and then try to answer them yourselves by determining what type of selection pattern are we going to see: directional selection, stabilizing selection, or disruptive selection, and why. Once you're done, go ahead and resume the video. All right, now that you're back, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these answers. We'll start with the first 2 questions. A population of peppered moths that live against a light-colored forest, they're going to show directional selection. In other words, we're going to use color or tone as our gradient, light to dark. Clearly, we're moving towards the light-colored moths. Those are going to be the ones that have the highest fitness, where the dark-colored moths are going to be consumed by birds and therefore not reproducing. That's a great example of directional selection. We're moving towards one direction, all light-colored moths. Human birth weights are a really interesting example because human birth weights actually show stabilizing selection. When we say human birth weights, what we mean is actually the weight at which a human is born. Now, the average human birth weight is around 7 pounds, and for good reason. If you get on the low side, so you're 2 or 3 pounds, you're a preemie. And chances are you don't have the mass or possibly the development to survive very well. So we know that the survivability of preemies is lower than those that are born at 7 pounds. But when you go beyond 7 pounds, like to 12, 13, 14 pounds, your survivability also drops as well for both the mother and the child. And the reason is because the mother or the child is too big to pass through the mother's birthing canal and get stuck, very often leading to the death of both without additional medical interference. So if we take away our medical abilities and just take a look at the human birth weight, we see stabilizing selection where the highest fitness is around the average, which is 7 pounds, and both extremes have lower fitness. What about the red blood cell phenotypes that we explored in the last lecture with sickle cell anemia? One of the things we addressed is that individuals that are little a, are going to have all sickled cells, and therefore they tend to die fairly young, very often before they reproduce. And so, of course, we would say their capacity to produce viable offspring is very low. And I'm using a little dot on that chart to show that. But then we go ahead and we move on to the big A, little a, and those are going to be the intermediates. The intermediates do have some health problems, but they are resistant to malaria. So they don't get malaria, or not easily, and so they tend to survive that, and they are capable of producing viable offspring. So we would say their fitness is medium to high. Then when we go ahead and we move and we take a look at big A, these are individuals that are considered to have normal red blood cells, but they are very susceptible to malaria. So if they get bitten by a mosquito that carries malaria, they very well may die before they reproduce. They're going to have lower fitness because they may not get to reproduce from the disease. So we might say their fitness is a little less than individuals that are big A, little a. When we draw a line graph over this, we see this very much looks like stabilizing selection. But let's go ahead and change the environment, because once again, environment matters. If we change the environment to the United States, where there is no malaria, malaria has been eradicated, then suddenly we take away the influence of malaria on fitness, and we say, well, big A has no health problems and therefore is going to have the highest fitness. In this case, we have directional selection. All right, so hopefully you did well on those. Let's move and talk about our final type of selection, which is called sexual selection. Sexual selection is based on mate choice. In other words, it's where one individual of one gender chooses the individual of another gender as their mate. It is seen most often in what we call sexually dimorphic species. These are species where the male and the female look really different. This is exemplified by birds, where male birds tend to be brightly colored and female birds are more drab. And the individual that gets to be choosy is the one that basically puts the most work into either offspring development or care. And almost always this is the female, but not always. So nobody exemplifies this more spectacularly than peacocks. Male peacocks are the ones that have this great array of feathers. And in this picture here, you see a female. The female is looking rather drab. If you've ever seen a male peacock try to court the female because the female gets to be choosy, it's hilarious. The male peacock basically spreads its feathers and then waves them to basically say, come on, you know you want me for your mate. And in this picture, you can see the female is clearly ignoring the male, saying, don't bother me, I'm eating, which is quite funny. But why does the female not have the showy feathers? Because she's putting the effort in for mating, and the male is really not putting in much effort other than providing sperm. So in this case, the male is trying to show the female, hey, look at my genes. Aren't I the perfect specimen, the perfect sign of health? Since you're going to put all this work into making babies, don't you want to give them the best chance possible for survivorship? And look at my feathers. I've got it. Okay, so that's basically what's going on there. We see sexual selection a lot when we look at marine mammals, especially in the pinnipeds. And here we have two northern male elephant seals that are fighting each other for access to females. And they fight each other based on size. The individual that has the larger size is the one that gets the better access to females. So in this case, sexual selection is for size. Size is a proxy for health. If you're really big, you're saying, I was able to go out and eat a lot of food, and so whatever I'm doing genetically is the right thing that you want to pass on to your babies. Okay, northern elephant seals make harems, and you can see in this picture a very large harem. There is one northern male elephant seal rearing up, and all the others around them are females. And so the females have selected this male elephant seal for his size, showing sexual selection. So we expect the babies that they make to also be of large size. All right, of course, the disadvantage to sexual selection is not everybody gets to be reproductively successful. Exemplified by the northern elephant seals, only 5% of males per breeding season actually get to reproduce with the females, and so many of them end up as unselected male elephant seals. So in this case, not everyone gets to be reproductively successful. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.